We're going to learn about two two investigations of the Underground Railroad. Dave and Kathy Tempest, who really were promoted uh, this Zoom, and they're doing a bike ride from New Orleans to Oberlin following the Underground Railroad path. That's a formal uh, ride that this is some kind of adventure, and they're going to talk about that. But and then that they're going to tell us why they were inspired to do this, and how this came about. And David Hoard is who did an Underground Railroad trek of a much different kind uh, in 1981, is going to tell us a little bit about he and, is it 8 others
Nine.
students, 9 other students, for an underground, for a winter term project, did a walk in the winter. Uh, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that, and then we're going to have some discussion about what was learned from these travels. So, Dave and Kathy, do you want to get started
Sure,
and tell us what
you
you're
bet.
doing and why you're doing it and where you are now?
Well, this is going to be a fun night. We're having an adventure, but I'll tell you, David and the 9 walkers, I call them, that's an amazing story. So stay tuned. But anyway, Kathy and I are in Cincinnati, and we're about 1,300 miles into our ride from New Orleans to Oberlin. Mostly along, it's adventure cycling. It's a group of 50,000 bicyclists who map routes all over the country, and they mapped a route. It's not the route, of course, for the Underground Railroad, because there are many, but it is a representative one. So we flew in from Seattle, where we live, to New Orleans with our bikes and gear, and we set off on April 23rd to ride. So we ride self-supported. We carry all our gear, food and tent and camping gear and bike tools and first aid and all that stuff.
Yeah, you might want to do the next slide. I don't know if
oh yeah, next slide.
Doug has been told to advance it.
I'm sorry, Doug. Yeah, let's put on the second slide. There's a picture of Kathy and me with our bikes
and our gear.
So we got about 45 pounds of gear.
We're not seeing your slides.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. So that's the route we took. Although we started in New Orleans and the official route starts in Mobile. So that's about 150, 200 mile ride to get to Mobile from New Orleans. And that's roughly the route. It goes all the way up to Canada. We're going to stop off, of course, at some little podunk town called Oberlin, I think, along the way. So that's us and the bikes, with lots of water coming through the south, because it's a very rural area.
And hot. And humid.
So we ride self-supported. We like to camp, but we don't always camp. We're not bashful about pulling into a motel in thunderstorms, which there have been plenty, or to stop in a metropolitan area. We spend an extra day in Mobile and Nashville and Louisville, and now in Cincinnati, we're going to spend some time exploring the city and their heritage as well. Doug, how about the next slide? So why this ride? Well, we kind of knew something about, like we were talking about before the start, we kind of knew something about Oberlin and its role and the stop on the Underground Railroad, but it was pretty superficial. So we wanted to increase that awareness and learn more about the history and the context of Oberlin's actions in the antebellum area when it was founded. And along those lines, I was back in Oberlin last October for homecoming weekend, because one of our swimming colleagues was admitted to the Heisman Hall of Fame. And so I had lunch with Kristen Peterson. I'm not sure if she's here tonight. I didn't see her name, but she's on our reunion committee, class of 72. And she's also an Oberlin City Councilwoman. And she walked me over to the Oberlin Heritage Center to meet Liz Schultz. And Liz, I saw your name here. So Liz was a terrific resource and started me reading a couple things, but one of which was Gary Kornblith and Carol Lasser's Elusive Utopia, the struggle for racial equality in Oberlin, Ohio, which is a fantastic read, and I highly recommend it. There's actually a link to that to a resource list that Liz put together on the website that Oberlin set up for our bike ride. And that website has a link in the announcement that was sent out, I think. So if you look at that, find the link, there's a whole list of resources. That's one of them though, I highly recommend it. So that was fascinating and it really got us excited. So next slide. So we're riding as a way to kind of honor that, pay homage to that heritage, and remind ourselves about Oberlin's role, but also to understand the context of what was going on at that time. And to maybe help lead into the question of, well, why Oberlin? Why was Oberlin important? What was the attraction of Oberlin? And what does that attraction have to teach us today? And maybe we can get into that discussion later on as we go. And the third reason we're riding is, well, we took up bike touring about 17 years ago and found it so rewarding for ourselves personally, for our health, for our relationship, for exploring and learning new things, that we've continued on. And frankly, we were looking for an excuse to go on a long bike ride, and this was a great one. So that's why we're walking. Next slide, or riding, I should say. But that leads us to this group. So I call these guys the 9 walkers. This was the most remarkable story and the most impressive winter term project I've heard about at Oberlin. And so I'm going to turn that over to David to tell us a little bit more about that.
So
Thank
David,
you, Dave.
yeah, we're back to 1981.
1980.
1980.
42 years ago. So with the winter term project. So I'm assuming you guys had to do winter term projects, if I recall. So our freshman year, and I apologize, Herman Beavers was going to be joining us, but he had to do another engagement in Nashville. He thought he had an earlier flight that got delayed, and now he's not going to be landing until 7:15. So he may still join us moving forward here. But our freshman year, we were trying to figure out what to do about winter terms, and so it was Lester, Herm, and myself, and Larry Spinks, Lester Barclay, and Larry Spinks. We were up in Mud Library. I don't know how, I thought they were reserved for seniors, but somehow we got one of those special rooms that overlooked the bowl. And so we were just hanging out there. And so we were just talking about winter terms and what we wanted to do and so forth. And so not a lot of people know this, but originally in that conversation, our goal was to go to Disney World, which was opening up. And we wanted to go to Florida. So let's tie in the Underground Railroad to getting down to Florida for and seeing Disney World and so forth. And so anyway, everybody, yeah, okay, we could walk it, we could do it. We'd try to figure out different angles. And then we decided, let's say that's the spring of our freshman year, so 77, 78 now. So we decided to really do some research and tied it into some of our courses, in our summer work. And then the next our sophomore winter term project was figuring out how we were going to do all of this and so forth. And so over that time period, Lester and I really took the lead on this project. And my father happened to live in Chicago. Lester lived in Chicago. So in the summers, so we ended up going down to Ebony Magazine and meeting with an African-American historian, Lerone Bennett. I mean, it's pretty, looking back now, it's like, yeah, we'll just go see Lerone. Let's walk in. And we did. So we said, we're here to see Mr. Bennett, Dr. Bennett. And so he did meet with us. We told him he said, you guys are kind of different, crazy. And originally the project was all males. It was just us guys doing it. Lerone mentioned that we needed to have, with Harriet Tubman and all the other female stories, you had to have women going on the project if you're going to do it. And so we agreed. So we went back to Oberlin and and recruited women, Marzella Player, Gayle Ellison, and Adrian Banks to participate on the project, and everyone agreed. So now we had 5 guys and 3 women on the project. That spring, I wrote a grant to the, well, let me, sorry. Lerone Bennett recommended that you needed to meet another historian who was in Chicago. And so he called John Hope Franklin, who is probably the foremost African-American historian of all time. The father, well, I won't say that, Carter G. Woodson. Anyway, that's another debate. So anyway, John Hope's in the top 4. So he invited us to lunch. And so we went to meet with John Hope Franklin that summer. And then, I think Herman's trying to get on. And so that summer we met with John Hope, and he suggested that we write a grant. And then we wrote this grant with the assistance of David Love and Hal Payne's office. They were administrators there at the time. Then we ended up getting the grant. That was huge. And so we had to tell our parents what we were planning to do. And so all of us would tell our parents, keep them updated and so forth. And then we had to figure out our own specialty areas. So like Herman was a sociology major. And Adrian was economics. And so she kept accounting for us. Lester and I were government majors. Larry was a government major. Marzella was a psychology major. And Gayle was a history and English major. So, and Richard Littlejohn had a photography interest. So he ended up doing all the photography and so forth. So we all try to stick to our areas of expertise, tying it into what we're doing. We did our research. We came up with a route that started in Greensburg, Kentucky, which was about 30, 40 miles. And Dave and Kathy happened to go near there on their bike ride. And so we started walking from there. And then, well, the end of the story is we ended up walking 420 miles, and we ended at Oberlin as we completed the project. We stayed in Kentucky. We would stay in the farms or corn cribs or different areas. But we also had a 20-foot RV that was like our home base. That was, and Larry Spinks, he had a very critical role because he would feed us. He would drive, he would keep things going. Yes, we did dress in slave garb, but we had Timberland or whatever the equivalent boots were at the time, walking boots. And we also had thermal underwear on as we did our walking. We did most of the walking during the day. People always ask us, was it really cold and how'd you deal with the snow? We lucked up. It was a pretty mild winter. And people would always have, well, did slaves escape in the winter and so forth? And not as many in the summer, but yes, escapes did occur in the winter. Because our experts were telling us that, the snow and it was harder to track with the dogs and so forth in the winter, with the constant melts and so forth occurring with snow and so forth. And so a lot of, and you can still follow the rivers, and you can still follow the North Moss and all those types of activities. So we ended up walking through Kentucky. One of the highlights, not only walking, I should say, prior to that, the prior semester, we worked with the Black Arts Theater Department, and they helped create a skit, or we had a 30 to 40 minute program that we would do gospel songs. I'll never forget, Adrian would do Sojourner Truth's I Am a Woman speech, poem. So we created a lot of activities from slavery experiences in various performances that we did at a lot of schools. And we walked, we did schools, and we and did churches, a lot of churches performances as well, all along the route as we're moving forward. For security purposes, we got letters from state senators and so forth. There's no way I would let my child do what we did. But we were gung ho, and so we were somewhat naive. But it's not like it is today with social media and all this. We weren't as scared, I guess. So we just went ahead and did it. And the highlight was Ripley, Ohio. We were just, Dave and Kathy, we were just talking about that. They just did the Ripley, Ohio this week. And so that we'd gotten a lot of press at this time. You know, back that was like, what was that show? GM, Good Morning America, but the PM, that was the show. So they were kind of following us, doing stories for the month that we were walking. And so when we got to Maysville, Kentucky, right outside of Ripley on the other side, they had arranged, and Larry and the group working with people in town had arranged for a boat to be there. And we ended up rowing across the Ohio River. And none of us had rowed a boat before. So I guess that was realistic, trying to get across the river. And then the amazing aspect, it took us about probably an hour and 20 minutes to get across the river. And, you know, they say it really should only take 20 minutes. But so the reporters and so forth are on another boat, and they just kept laughing at us and so forth. We actually landed on the Ohio side. We were really happy to land. And then the media were like, "Can you go back out? Because we need to get the film crews on this side to get you coming up the hill and so forth." And we were like, "Oh man," you know, it's like, no, we were exhausted, to tell you the truth, from all that rowing. And so anyway, we did. They got their shots, and then school was right there. So we did a presentation for a school, had come down to the river and greeted us. And then we started the Ohio segment. So we walked on down to the Rankin House, walked up the huge bank of, and then you can see the Rankin House from the Kentucky side very clearly, where you could cross the river or the house was open. If it was one was okay, two or candles in the windows, no, don't come across too many.
I'm sorry, David, Rankin House, can you tell us a little bit more about what that is?
It literally it's a house on top of a hill. And John Rankin was an abolitionist. And so he helped hundreds, thousands of slaves escape. And his house really literally was a candle or two candles would warn people to whether it was okay to come there or not before they went down. I think it was John Porter. John Rankin was white, but John Porter also was a black man and he kind of did the same thing, and he didn't get the same credit and so forth that John Rankin did. But that was some of the interesting stories we found out as we were going down on this path as we walked. We ended up walking all the way, all the way through Ohio, and ended up on time. Publicity-wise, Oberlin was milking this every day now. We had our own press person with us. They were doing stories. There were no blogs or podcasts or any of those type of things. So we just kept our journals and so forth. And then we got to Wellington. So we were able to highlight the Oberlin-Wellington escape, or not escape, but the Oberlin-Wellington rescue. And then that morning, a lot of our family and friends were waiting for us as we walked the last 8 miles from Wellington. I think we were stationed at a dairy place, probably still there. And then we walked the 8 miles into Oberlin. Many of you knew or remember Bill Long. He used to be at the bookstore, the co-op bookstore. So he had written a play called The Feast of Felons. And so Oberlin had agreed to work with the community. So students and community members did the Feast of Felons, which is a celebration tied to the Oberlin-Wellington, was a play tied to the Oberlin-Wellington escape, and told that story. So that evening, once we got back, we ended up all going to the play. That probably was the first night we were parents, and that was the best meal we had in a long time. So that was kind of good. And so we finished the project, and then we all ended up doing a lot of just a lot of television interviews. Of course, we were very confident that we were able to pull this off. We were excited about it. People were asking us, what are your feelings? And it was an opportunity. We always said it was all about, we highlighted man's inhumanity to man, but we were able to demonstrate, for the most part, there were a few incidents like in Belltown, Kentucky, where we ran into some trouble there from white racists and so forth. But we were, it was a positive trip. People would leave papers for us, family papers of slave papers, all kinds of things for us, flowers, different spots on the route. So actually we ended up donating and giving that, but I actually have a lot of stuff here in a box. So that's the hand to stop. I will stop. That's the story of the Underground Railroad project.
I wanted to bring Dave and Kathy back in to tell us a little bit more. Dave, you mentioned David Tempest. You mentioned when we talked about this that somehow the George Floyd murder was part of what motivated you to think about the Underground Railroad as opposed to any other ride you might have taken or chosen to take. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the George Floyd murder really raised the issue. There's a lot of issues, resurfaced issues of race in America. And in Seattle, the protests and Black Lives Matters movement was very active. It got a lot of national press. But about that time, I was flying back to Oberlin, and the natural question is, okay, what would Oberlin do? How would Oberlin address this? What would Oberlin's stance be? What's its vision? And what's its heritage in dealing with similar questions in the past? I mean, lynchings were going on, for heaven's sakes. Dealing with similar issues in the past. And what lessons were there, perhaps, to learn from that experience? And that's where I think, Carol and Gary and others have so much insight and so much to teach us. And I hope we get, and maybe we get a discussion coming up here in a little bit that can get into that a little bit. But that kind of raised our awareness. And again, from that led into the decision to do the Underground Railroad to get a better context of the times going on and the issue of race in America and slavery and oppression in America and the drive for freedom and anyway, so that's what got us into things.
You've been, I've noticed in your blog, you've been visiting some historic places along the way. You've included photographs of markers, and in other words, you're not just riding your bikes from one place to the other. You're doing some actually Black history touring, and maybe if there are any places that are particularly stand out in your mind along the way that you could tell us about?
Yeah, there are lots of stuff. First of all, let me just say one thing about David. He talks about the mild weather, but he didn't tell you that the last night before they got to Oberlin, it was 12 degrees, right?
Yeah. I'm talking about snow, perhaps, but yeah, it was cold. Now it was cold.
Okay, well, there were several, and Doug, you want to start putting up the next slide? So we've seen a lot of stuff, and I think it falls into a couple of categories. The first category is kind of the recognition that, there you go. The recognition that the African-American heritage is getting now in many ways. And we saw that several places. Our first overnight was in Mobile, Alabama. And this is a slide from the African-American Heritage Trail website. And we spent a day in Mobile walking about 12 miles around the town, trying to find as many of these historical markers as we could. And it was a remarkable story. And it was I think that, I don't know if you can read on that slide, but the title is Listen to Their Struggles, Recognize Their Courage, Feel Their Determination, and Celebrate Their Accomplishments. And that was just beautifully outlaid all around the city. And that was very helpful to see. Next slide. While we were walking, we walked through the new Africa Town. The old Africa Town is where a lot of the emancipated slaves, including survivors from the Clotilda, the last slave ship to land there, had settled. And it's still economically depressed, but I just thought this mural was a symbol of the vibrancy of that community and its spirit surviving the oppression of slave and the cruelty of slavery. Next slide. But we ended in Mobile at this site. Just a reminder of the burden of that oppression. And that kind of set the tone. We kind of knew this, but yet there it is, that you're actually standing where that slave market was. Just as a reminder of the cruelty. Next slide. But then, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Rosenwald schools. I hope, I can't see the audience right now, but I hope you do know. If you don't know, that this is the most remarkable story of successful philanthropy that I've ever heard of in the United States. So Booker T. Washington, we know as the leader of the Tuskegee Institute, a great educator, the spokesperson, certainly. Oh, Herman's here. Oh, great. And he recruited Julius Rosenwald, who was the CEO of Sears. Basically, he was the Jeff Bezos of today, because Sears was like Amazon. And to be on his trustee, they formed up a relationship. Rosenwald was Jewish. His family had survived the pogroms in Europe, and he had great sympathy for the oppression and prejudice that the Black community was facing. So he worked with Booker T. Washington, not as a savior to come down, but saying, hey, what can we do? And they worked together, and they collaborated to form the Rosenwald Fund, which funded Booker T. Washington said, basically what we really need education for Black children in the South. So they worked together to form the Rosenwald schools, where they built a lot of schools where Rosenwald Fund put up the seed money. They recruited the efforts of the Black community to either help with the payment or put in sweat equity. And then they got the white school districts who were paying nothing to contribute to that funding as well. And then he helped fund the teachers. So they had qualified teachers come in. Together, over the next 17 years, they built 5,000 schools throughout the South, educating at one point up to 1/3 of Black children in the United States and in the South. And that was from the deep South over to Texas, hundreds of schools in each state. So some of the, John Lewis, for instance, was a graduate of that program. And Maya Angelou was also a graduate of one of those programs, amongst others. And I won't even talk about the Rosenwald scholarships and what their role was. But I just thought this was a marvelous example of people, Black and white, Christian and Jewish, recognizing a problem and not trying to solve it by themselves, but being collaborative. And if there's not a lesson in that for us today, I'm not sure where there is. Anyway, that was a high point of our trip, because Rosenwald, there's a movie Rosenwald.
There's a movie Rosenwald, and we've been enthralled ever since.
If you ever get a chance.
See it.
Next slide. All along the way, we saw more and more what I was initially talking about. That is a recognition of African-American Black heritage in our society. So this was in Aberdeen, Mississippi. We were just riding through where the street was blocked off by a police car. We got off to look around, and they said, hey, come on over. And so this was a group celebrating the opening of the Aberdeen Black History Trail. And it was in front of the mural of, I think that's Bucka White, one of the Mississippi Blues celebrities, and a local native son. And if nothing else, to visit Aberdeen, it's worth seeing this fabulous mural that they have. Next slide. And then we hit Nashville and spent a lot of time at the Tennessee State Museum. Oh my goodness, is that awesome. And we found Nashville both vibrant and trying to come to grips with its heritage, because it was a deep slave state. Andrew Jackson marched slaves out of there on, well, we'll come to that in the next slide. But anyway, they have a lot of historical markers around the city, and the State Museum is really terrific. If you get a chance, please see it. But one of the places, I'll just take a couple slides from there. One of them was of Mary Church Terrell. Now, she's from Nashville. she's not from that, but she's was in the museum. She's
Memphis. She's from Memphis.
Memphis, that's right. Well-known civil rights activist, suffragette, one of the founders of the NAACP, and of course, an Oberlin College graduate of class of '84, with her master's even in 1988. So that was fun to see. Next slide.
1880.
1888, yeah, 18, yeah. But the flip side of that was the museum did a nice job. It's hard to say nice, but an open, honest job, I think, of looking at the other side of oppression, the cruelty of it. Now we biked 150 miles on the Natchez Trace National Parkway, which is an ancient route of Native Americans first founded, and everybody else then used as a business and travel route. But it was known for many things, one of which was the Slave Trail of Tears, where over a period of 30 years, up to 1 million slaves were moved. They didn't move, they were moved from the near South, Virginia in particular, down to the expanding new Southwest, which would be, Louisiana and Texas and parts of Arkansas and so on. As the cotton fields expanded there, as the cotton gin came into effect and cotton fields became profitable, plantations became profitable, slaves were bought and moved down the slave trail of tears in what we'll call coffles. And I didn't know what a coffle was. I'm not sure how many of you know that, but I looked it up. It's an ugly word. It means a line of animals or slaves fastened and driven along together. Let that sink in for a little bit. So it was a very cruel pathway. Andrew Jackson, our president, who was the voice of the common man, drove a coffle of slaves on his as part of his slave trading in his early days, for instance. Next slide. The advantage of the Natchez Trace Trail that introduced us to the treatment of the Native Americans who had lived in this area for millennia, of course. And the reason we call it the Slave Trail of Tears because the initial Trail of Tears was to describe the Native American forced exodus from their native lands to Oklahoma and parts of Arkansas. After many failed treaties had promised them, broken treaties had promised them their sacred lands forever. So at one point, I think in 1930, Andrew Jackson helped get passed again the Indian Removal Act, which led to the forced expulsion eventually of 12 to 17,000 Indians from the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, and other tribes through this area, which about a third, I think they said 3,000 or 4,000 did not survive because of dysentery, malnutrition, etc. So there was the Native American Trail of Tears. So there was this cruelty scattered through our history. I think there's one more slide there. So I want to end on a little different note. So we stopped at the Mammoth Caves National Park. Great stop if you ever get a chance. And there's a lot of history there. One of the people we met was Stephen Bishop, whose picture that is in the center there, who was a Black man and a slave, who was relegated to the caves as a guide. This is after the saltpeter mines were closed after the wars with Britain. And so the cruel labor down there wasn't going on, but guiding was. And so he was a guide. And he went beyond that and became an explorer. And he created maps over the years that for 40 some years stood as the standard for exploration of those caves. He became known as a sable genius. And he guided foreign scientists and dignitaries of all kinds, presidents and senators, through these things. What struck us was both his ability to rise above slavery and the fact that when he walked out of that cave, he was still a slave. Anyway, that was some of the highlights. We're actually now, we just spent, like I say, 4 hours today at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, which is a spectacular museum or center to visit. And if you ever get a chance, spend some time there. There's a lot of wonderful history there.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David and Kathy. David H., can we get you back on to maybe talk about some highlights of the whole trip seems like a highlight, but there might have been the really most noteworthy. I see Herman has arrived.
Hi,
Hi,
Herman.
What's up, Herm? Why don't I let Herm talk a little bit? I kind of opened it up and so forth.
Well, my apologies for being late. Blame American Airlines. But I saw Dave holding it down. So what should I talk about, Dave? Because it sounds like you hit all the major points.
Well, why don't you talk about the highlights for you? You know, it's
For me?
for you. Yep.
Well, let's see. I don't know if Dave mentioned this. I was the only member of the group from Ohio.
That's true.
I was raised in Cleveland. So when we got to the Ohio River, and I looked from Kentucky across the Ohio River and saw Ohio, I was like, oh, that's home. So that was a big deal. Dave was describing our ordeal rowing across the Ohio River, where I'm surprised we didn't drown. Had we really been escaping from slavery, we'd have been taken back into bondage in about 5 minutes. But the whole thing was a high point. I think the high point for me was the kindness of people that took us into their homes, sight unseen. Dave mentioned Larry Spinks, and it was Larry's job to go ahead of the group and arrange for a place for us to stay. And he would knock on the doors of people that were absolute strangers, who just were so intrigued with our story that they let us sleep on their living room floor, or it was a church that let us sleep in their sanctuary or in their upstairs. So the thing that was most surprising, the high point for me, was the kindness of people who had no reason to be kind to us. And by that, I mean, it wasn't just Black folks that we encountered. There were some white people that were really kind to us. There was a couple in Lexington. We stayed in their house maybe a couple of days, and their house had been built in the early 19th century, and they still had a number of pieces of furniture from that time. We slept in a bed that had been made in like 1850, and it was so big, like 4 of us could sleep in the bed. So it was, we got over our squeamishness about huddling together for warmth. One night we slept in a barn, and the temperature went down to 19 degrees. And I was sleeping next to Lester Barkley, and I was seriously contemplating strangling him in his sleep, because he was the one that talked me into coming on the trip. I had several fantasies about doing Lester physical harm. I'm not sure if I've even told him that, but the first couple of days when we walked a long way and I found out we still had a long way to walk, that was a little bit demoralizing. But again, the kindness of the people that we met. Dave, did you tell them about the minister in, I forget what town that was?
Yeah, no, I forget the name of the town, but Reverend Porterfield.
Yes, Reverend
no,
Porterfield.
I didn't go into that story, but you could
Dave,
tell it.
Dave, you got to tell that story, because we're staying in this church, and I can't remember what town it was. Was it Porterfield, Ohio? Was it named after the folks?
It might have been. Yeah, I need to go back.
It was the second or third place we stopped, and we got there on a Saturday evening, so we stayed over Sunday morning for the church service. And in the midst of that, the minister asked David, who was your grandfather? And Dave says, well, my grandfather was Strobridge Hoard. And this gentleman says, that was the man that brought me into the ministry.
Yeah, it was crazy. Crazy stuff.
I mean, and at that point, we started to know that this was a very special endeavor that we were on, because it was just random chance that we stopped in the town in the first place. because they were the people that let us sleep in their church basement. So I think for me, that's when I began to realize that the trip was blessed, in ways that we could not even anticipate. And I guess the other high point for me was when we were in Lexington. We were going to do our first presentation, and that afternoon I wrote a poem that I read at the presentations for just about the entire trip. And if to my horror, I think the poem is still hanging up in African Heritage House.
I am
It's
as well.
awful.
Yeah. I heard it's still there.
It's an absolutely terrible poem, but if there was any way I could declaim ownership of it, I would. But what made it special was I think writing that poem made me feel more a part of the group, because I was the only poet in the group, and so it was because I read it in every presentation. I got tired of reading it. I read it so many times, but people responded well to it. And it was a poem about our present situation. So it was relevant. Did you talk about Dover, Kentucky, Dave?
You talking about Belltown where we had to run?
No. I'm talking about Dover the night before we crossed the river.
No, I didn't talk about that.
I don't know if you remember this. We were walking through this county in Kentucky, and it was one of the last counties before you got to the river. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard of a sundown county. This county we were walking through was a sundown county because the county sheriff came and met us out on the road and said, we've been getting calls about a bunch, and I know he wanted to use the N-word. There were a bunch walking on the road, and people were calling in about us. And I guess it had to be around Martin Luther King's birthday, so I guess they thought we were demonstrating. It's pretty stupid because we had on really raggedy clothes and we didn't have any signs. But he came out and made it clear in no uncertain terms, you need to be out of this county by sundown. He was as cordial, I guess, as a racist white man can be in northern Kentucky. So we get to the town where we're going to stay, and when we get there, this police cruiser blocks our path, and he just sits there with his red and blue lights flashing, with his lights shining in our face. And earlier that day, right as we were starting to walk that day, we had met this couple who turned out to be a former priest and nun, and they had fallen in love and gotten married, and they had settled in this town. And so we're standing in front of this police cruiser. We're not sure if he's going to get out with his pump action shotgun and shoot us or arrest us. We don't know what's going to happen, but we're all terrified. And right at that moment, this couple pulls up in their station wagon, and they pile us into the station wagon. The rest of us pile into the camper, and they take us to this church where we stayed that night. And they did that all because they were concerned about us walking through this sundown county. That's what I mean about the kind of kindness of strangers that we experience, because had they not done that, who knows what would have happened. We might not have made it to the river to have that debacle of rowing across the river. We might not have made it. But it was, but again, it was one of those moments where I just realized how blessed we were, because these people, we just had a random conversation with them. I don't even know how it came up that they had been a nun and a priest. But we walked probably 10 or 15 miles that day, and I completely forgot about them. And they came out and they got us and they took us to someplace safe. So crossing over into Ripley, Ohio was certainly a high point. Walking up the hill to the John, what was the name of the place?
Rankin House.
The John Q. Rankin House, yes. That was a special moment. And then, you know, just the trip back to Oberlin. We were in such great physical shape that we were ahead of schedule and we had to slow down a couple days
Mhm.
because we were supposed to arrive back at Oberlin at the very end of January. And at the rate we were going, we would have gotten back a week early. So we sort of slowed down. We stayed in Columbus for a couple days, and we stayed at Denison University for a couple 3 days.
Mhm.
And you know, we made it back. And the day that we made it back, it was so cold. Oberlin was so cold that morning. I was like, oh, this is what winter's like. Because Dave is right. It really was a mild winter in Kentucky. But when we got to Ohio, that's when it got cold.
Thanks, Herman. We're gonna move to some questions and answers. So people, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or you can raise your hand. But until we had some questions, I think Lucy Rubin, you had a story about the Rosenwald schools. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
No, I was sorry because we were having storms in the Carolinas and the Deep South, and therefore I was going in and out of this. What a number of people I knew growing up went to these Rosenwald schools because even though during Reconstruction, hello?
Yeah, we're here. We hear you.
Good. We're having a time in terms of the weather here. But even though during Reconstruction, a number of the Black Congress people from the South, they actually instituted a lot of the first mass public schools in the country. And I'm not a historian. I had the pleasure of knowing John Hope Franklin, but I'm not a historian, but I do know that. And but even though they were sanctioned after Reconstruction, they did not provide funding. And so many Blacks in the South did not have access to regular public education in a systematic way until into the 40s, into the 1940s. So for example, the minister who married my husband and me, and I'm bringing him to Oberlin for the reunion, actually attended a Rosenwald school out in Eastern North Carolina, which is New Bern, North Carolina was one of the first places with slaves and so forth, and has ties to Ghana to today. And they're still trying to salvage some of those Rosenwald school structures in many places, including out in Eastern North Carolina. I'm in Durham, North Carolina right now, and I grew up in South Carolina. And in order, you talked about, thank you very much for talking, Dave and Kathy, about the Rosenwald efforts for philanthropy in terms of educating Blacks. As part of that, I said, I always knew that because she told us that my mother went to graduate school on a Rosenwald fellowship. She went to Fisk for undergraduate, where she followed John Hope Franklin. And I told him that when I first met him, and he was always very kind to me. But because these were the Deep South schools, Fisk and others, they had access to graduate school in large part, in many cases, through the Rosenwald Scholarship. So in segments of the Black community, not enough, but some of that Rosenwald story is known, particularly for those of us who knew that generation.
Thank you, Lucy. Georgianne, you had a question in the chat. Can you ask that out loud?
Actually, Herman kind of answered it, but I just thought it was fascinating. You should teach Oberlin students how to do this, a multi-year winter term. It just sounds like it was such a life expanding experience to meet people who encourage you to meet other people, and that the administrators helped you write a grant. I just think that was such good preparation for life. And of course, you've been writing grants ever since, right? John or David?
Yeah, I mean, it really truly did affect my career choice and so forth. So fundraising all evolved out of that. Yeah. For me, the ironic thing was some of you, what Miss Herod, Elizabeth Herod, who was in the registrar's office. For the African American students, she was the queen. I mean, she was one of the ones that really took care of us. But Miss Herod called me about run a call. What did they do back then? Sent you a note, and so she said to come see her in the registrar's office. I was like, okay, I'm getting ready to graduate and so forth. And she said, you have not completed all of your winter terms. You have not. And I was like, what are you talking? Everyone know. I mean, everyone know. Oh, what are you talking about? And she goes, you technically never registered the January 1990 as your winter term. Can you fill out this form just so we can check you off and so forth? So that was interesting. But so yeah, I mean, for all of us, it was like a 2-year experience beforehand. There was another African American woman, Kim McKeithen, was going to go with us, but she did her semester abroad in Ghana. And we just couldn't communicate her, so it just didn't work out planning when we actually started walking there right after Christmas or getting down to Greensburg and so forth. So I do want to give her recognition. There were 2 reporters who went with us. Derek Reveron, who was a Minneapolis Star, so he did stories. I guess he would call them in. We remember him going to payphones and calling in these stories, and then a photographer would fly in and take photos, or he would take photos. And then Jane Littleton from the Cleveland Plain Dealer also walked probably 10 days with us in Ohio and so forth, gathering up stories. So there was a lot of people. There were a lot of hands, angels, that helped us through this whole thing. Because again, we're only 17, 18, 19, years old. So it was we were naive. And then, when you look back, we were confident young African Americans. We thought we could do this, and we did it. And so the other, as Herm's one of the most distinguished English professors in America now. Adrian Banks, international trade banking. She's in Japan every other week, might be there now. I try to reach her for this. Marzella's real estate, she's in DC. Larry went into distinguished career with defense intelligence and then CIA. He did a lot. Richard Littlejohn went into insurance. George Barnwell is, I think he's at Wachovia. He's
in banking.
Yeah, he's in banking, attorney, general counsel.
So,
it was
David,
Wachovia.
we have some questions building up.
Okay, all right, we'll do quick answers. Okay.
Yeah, Doug Rose asked, besides the police car, did you have any harrowing experiences similar to escaping traveling slaves?
Yeah, my story I told a little earlier when we were planning this was in Belltown, Kentucky. Larry, our front man, advance man, had arranged for us to sleep in a barn that evening. It was a woman. She was there by herself and so forth. So I guess, so we're in the barn, everything's cool, cold. Got arranged, actually we're getting ready to go to sleep and so forth. And then we heard pickup trucks coming down this. It was, I don't know, Herman, it was like a 1-lane road almost. I can't remember, but
it was a 2-lane highway.
2-lane, yeah, a little back road, and then it was where the niggers, we hear this and we see these pickup trucks coming at us. So that literally was, we just packed up real fast, got running, talk about how to meet up if we had to meet up, split up and so forth. Larry ran to get the van, took off. Some people went another direction, but we were able to hook everybody up together. But that for me was the most harrowing experience, the most real. And we were, that shook me. You remember that night, Herm?
I do remember it. I do remember him waving that baseball bat and yelling at us.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Mhm.
You know, there were instances where people yelled at us from cars.
A lot of
And I
that.
think in one instance, Lester and Jane Littleton were walking on the shoulder, and his truck came so close to them. If Lester hadn't pushed her down slightly down the embankment, the truck would have hit them. But you know, we could have gotten much worse, because we were at the first part of the trip. Larry or Rich would call Oberlin every day to let them know that we hadn't been lynched, because we were in places that didn't have pay phones and didn't have you know, gas stations or anything like that where we could stop. And we really were to say backwoods, I think it's to insult people that live there, but it was off the beaten track. They were state routes. They were not. I remember when we got to the part of Ohio that connects to I-271, they're like, okay, we're definitely not slaves, because there were no interstates when there were slaves. But you know, I think Dave is right that there were a few really harrowing moments, but like I said, there were also moments where people's humanity really led them to step up and look out for us. You know, there were strange moments. We had a really upsetting encounter in Mount Vernon, Ohio, I think, where we had gone to an ice cream place, and the server got a little bit testy with us and threatened to call the manager on us. And we realized it was Southern Ohio. We sort of decided that it wasn't worth police officers coming in the place with their guns drawn. So we beat a hasty retreat. But it was little stuff. It was not, you know, that police car was probably the moment where I felt the most afraid.
And you gotta think, you know, we're all in slave garb, walking through these towns. Nobody knew who the hell we were or what we, what are these 8, 9 black? Who is this? What are they doing? What is going on, and so forth.
Right.
And we were kind of naive. We were like, didn't everybody know who we were? You know, it was, and not really, but yeah, it was an interesting time and so forth. So the sociological implications, we all got to use our majors. That was true. That was good.
I see that Jane Littman has posted in the chat. She says it's not a question. The Rosenwald schools and scholarships are a somewhat lost and important part of history. Thanks for your attention to this. That's to David. Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, it's just such a remarkable story and a successful one of collaboration. And really, you can read all about the Rosenwald. I mean, the Rosenwald scholarships are Miriam Anderson, for heaven's sakes, got to Germany on a Rosenwald scholarship. And it's just an incredible success story. And if you get a chance, it's not out, you can't just rent it. We bought a copy of the movie called Rosenwald from the Jewish National Film Center or something.
Like that. Yeah, we can look it up.
But if you get a chance to see that, it does focus on Rosenwald more than Booker T. Washington, although he gets a pretty good amount of press in that too. It's a wonderful movie and a wonderful story.
I agree. The movie is absolutely wonderful, and you guys are doing this just tremendous thing. I'm so glad that you were willing to share it with us. And I agree with you. If people can watch that movie, the collaboration is the main thing that is emphasized. How he went about not just donating the money, but developing the collaboration. So thanks. And living in South Carolina, I guess that also came to my attention. So, thank you for doing this.
I will say one of the things that the issue raised, all these people, probably 30,000 we heard escaped across the Ohio River into this region, and probably 100,000 total along the Underground Railroad. And they're escaping to this mystical thing called freedom. And what Gary Kornblith and Carol Lasser, one of the things they taught us in their book, they said that in 1835, when Oberlin committed to admitting Black students on an equal basis, there were 0 Black members of the community in Russian Township and Oberlin. By 1860, 20% of the population in Oberlin was African American. So the question was, what was the draw? And to us, it seems pretty clear that in some ways, Oberlin was a success story at that time in working towards an inclusive community. It was certainly considered a safe community. They banded together as a community with the congregational church bell being the call to action, and if it rang in a certain way where all the community would pour out to inhibit slave hunters trying to track down escaped slaves. And that happened on more than one occasion. The most famous one, of course, is John Price and the Wellington Rescue. But it was that type of safe community and inclusive community, relatively inclusive. It certainly wasn't an equal opportunity community yet by a long stretch, but it was relative to everything else, a remarkable community. And that's one thing we've kind of learned on this trip to appreciate about Oberlin, and it struggles later on. It's not a completely altruistic story, but anyway, I'll stop there.
Felicia Bowman asked
Yeah.
a question of Herman, I think. Do you remember? Do you want to speak, Felicia? You go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to answer Dave's question with my family story, which I'm still researching.
Please do.
It starts in Kentucky with Lucy Chin, who was enslaved, I believe, with Richard Mentor Johnson, who was the 9th Vice President of the United States. He had inherited her and her family. And she was a rebel. She had 5 children, we believe, at least one by Mentor Johnson himself. And of course, this was not a consensual or relationship. But fortunately for her, Henry Alexander, who was a Black man who had bought his own freedom, bought her freedom and that of all 5 of her children, and in 1832. And the first thing they did was send, particularly the girls, but they sent their children to Oberlin. Oberlin was the beacon of light. Oberlin stood for freedom and education. And their daughter Louisa graduated from Oberlin's 4-year ladies literary course in 1856. And my husband and I, class of 1969, are the 16th and 17th members of our family to go to Oberlin. So the appeal was that Oberlin stood for freedom and education. And our family has benefited over the years. We have, my sister's granddaughter just graduated from college last week, and she'll be the 7th generation of Black female college graduates in my family, starting back to Louisa in 1856. My cousin Ida Gibbs Hunt, who was in the same class with Mary Church Terrell and Anna J. Cooper, graduating in 1884. She was born in 1862, and I lived with her the first 10 years of my life. She was 80. I was born in 1947. She was 85 years old. She was part of W.E.B. Du Bois Pan-African Congress. She spoke fluent French and several languages. She got a master's degree from Oberlin. So that's the answer: freedom and education. And it started in Kentucky, and they lived in Mays Lick, Kentucky. That's why I asked about And there's now a National Underground Railroad Museum in Mays Lick. It's not as big as the one in Cincinnati. So I'm hoping to go there in the next few years and do further research, because I think Henry was involved in helping enslaved people escape to Ohio.
Alicia,
Thank
we
Thank you.
in
Phil.
Maysville, we came by the National Underground Railroad Museum.
Oh, you did?
Took a picture, but it was closed.
closed.
It's only open like Fridays and Saturdays. We were there on a Thursday, so we missed it, but we saw it there. And boy, that's a hotbed for action. Going, interestingly enough, Kathy noticed this, going both directions. The Underground Railroad funneled through there because it was a way to get across the Ohio and the hotbed of abolitionism, or at least sympathy on both sides of the river. But Maysville was also the stopping point for slaves traveling from Virginia down the Ohio River and then being driven in coffles and whatnot down the roads the other direction to feed the demand for labor in the Deep South. And that's part of the story that Kathy knows, that the Underground Railroad is only a small part of the story of the trip that we're on anyway, an important part, but it's just, your story is fascinating. It really ties the history together. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And well, I hope to get find more information. I've talked to people at that museum, and I hope to visit it.
There's also in Mobile, there was the National African American Archives. I think, was it Archives? I'll have to look it up. But it sounded like they have an extensive, and they were closed when we went to their place, but they were closed that day also.
Right.
National Underground, I'll have to look it up. Mobile, Alabama, on the African American Heritage Trail. It's like the second or third stop. But I don't know what records they have, how detailed their records are.
I'm also looking for the records of Sanford Mitchell, who bought Lucy from Richard Mentor Johnson. And I'm hoping to find further information. There's a book coming out the end of this year by a professor, I think at University of Indiana, on Julia Chin, who was Lucy's aunt. And there's a lot written on Julia Chin and her relationship with Richard Mentor Johnson.
We have a couple more questions, and I think we have time for maybe two more. One is not a question. Tula Hazelrig wrote, I should know this, but have you written a book about your walk? I guess that's David and Herman, with photos and news stories. Question, it's an amazing story.
Nope.
Well, get to work.
Have not done it. Have not done it. I don't think I would have got tenure writing a book like that. But
yeah, I mean, there's still time.
Maybe there's still time. Yes.
I was just sorting through. I had a lot of the original materials and so forth, and so this summer I'm just going to drive up to Oberlin and give it to the archives.
Do you still have the slides?
Yeah.
Do you still have the
Yeah,
slides?
I got a lot of the slides, the 8-track, Lord, the 8mm film.
We should have all that stuff digitized.
And I had some, but anyway, I'm just gonna give it to Oberlin and let them do their thing with it and so forth.
I see a question from Lydia. We have a question from Lydia Newcomb, and let that be the last question. Lydia, are you there? She says, I have an interest in Northern slavery, particularly in the 17th century Dutch colonial period on New York State. So if there's a time, I'd like to ask if anyone is working on that subject and some commentary about my community. Lydia, are you there?
I can say a little.
I come from the mid-Hudson Valley, and from the early 1650s or 1620s to 1664, when the British came over, the Dutch were importing slaves. And when I went to school, this was not taught. I was shocked about 12 years ago to find out the extent of this. Of course, Sojourner Truth is very well known. She's from my town, but it was not taught. And I suspect even my Black contemporaries were not that aware of it. So I joined an African American history committee, and I decided to do research since my church there's a very old Dutch Reformed church, which has a complicated relationship with slavery. And I researched baptisms, marriages, and church memberships, and also census records. So I got some data on early patterns of slavery, where they lived, what they did for professions, or what work they did. And there wasn't a great interest in it, but now there is. Now that the town is coming awake, and we have Black people named Vander Zee are looking for white people named Vander Zee and wanting to get together and explore their past relationships. So it's really getting interesting. And on the weekend that I'll be at the reunion, we'll be having a Pinkster, our very first Pinkster celebration. That was a carnival that the Dutch, it's an African Dutch carnival that was, the Black people were in the spring on Pentecost were free for 1 week to do a market, a fair, a parade, dancing, and so forth. And
well, you know,
I
don't mean to cut you off. Sorry, please go continue.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that probably now about 25 years ago, anthropologist Michael Blakey, who's at William and Mary, I think, uncovered a graveyard on Wall Street that was a graveyard where slaves were buried, and one of the graves that he unearthed contained the body of a 7-year-old little girl who had been worked to death. You know, when you looked at the skeleton and he looked at the stress on the skeleton, it was very clear that she had been worked. She'd been worked to death. So yeah, that story about Northern slavery has not been fully told.
No.
You know, particularly when you consider that New Jersey did not abolish slavery until the 1880s.
Mm-hmm.
So I was doing some work in the archives, and come to find out that there were people who were still unofficially slaves even after the Emancipation Proclamation. And because New Jersey was a state in the Union, they weren't covered by the Emancipation Proclamation.
New York in 1827. Same thing. Yeah.
I think we're kind of at the end of our.
So yeah, this story that hasn't been told, but that story is waiting for somebody to write that thing.
Yeah.
We've got
Could be that's you.
We've got 824, and I think our Doug, is this the end of our period, Doug? It's 8:24. I think we may be getting to the end of our Zoom reservation time. I want to thank everybody who signed on, and thank David and Kathy for making this happen. You know, this is just an amazing thing. You're right, and the blog is fascinating. I encourage everybody to look at the blog of his daily entries on where they are and what they're doing and what they're experiencing. And then David Hoard and Herman Beavers of the class of, what were you, 81?
81. Yeah.
81, yes.
We're sharing some of their experience. I think there was an article in the alumni magazine, and we're waiting patiently, but enthusiastically for the book, or for the what you're going to produce that, you know, kind of puts it all together and tells the whole story. So maybe you need a ghostwriter, but it should happen. Maybe there's some current student who wants to work on it. I see one on this Zoom who's working on something. Felicia, thank you for your questions. Thank everybody for your.
Hey, I'd be willing to collaborate.
Yeah.
And thank everybody for I think this was a very interesting event. Doug, you have something you want to say?
Just one thing, not directly related to the Zoom, but just a word from the alumni office. And that was a number of people from the reunion classes were this year were trying to register on Friday, but there were some glitches on the registration. And so Alan Goldman let the reunion committee know Friday to try to let people know that even though the deadline had been Friday, it's been extended until Monday night at 11:59 p.m. So if you had tried on Friday to register but have been unable to, I would try. You could try over the weekend. I tried this morning and it still had glitches, but definitely on Monday. And if register, contact the alumni office directly, and they'll get. Thank you.
Thank you. If we have 2 more minutes, any final thoughts?
Well, I gotta say thank you to Gayle, because as we went through this, Kathy and I were thinking of riding the Underground Railroad, and we mentioned it to the committee, and Gayle said, "Well, have you heard about, have you heard about the winter term project?" I said, "No, what about the winter?" So she sent me David and Lester Barkley and Herman's names, and I contacted them, and it's been just a blast to read their. Just to start with, read the Alumni Magazine article as referenced in the announcement. It's really terrific. But Gayle's been this resource all through the planning for this our reunion. Every time something comes up, I say, I'm wondering about. And she'll say, "Oh, what did you talk to?" And she'll have 5 people to talk to. I don't know how she knows all these people, but she's been terrific. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you.
And,
Tom Gold has it.
Tom Gold has
Just for, a question. Just, I mean, have there been other groups, other people who have done this? Have you guys set a standard, or it was pioneers that there have been other people between 1980 and Kathy and Dave? Has this become a regular trek? Not just from Oberlin, but I mean following the Underground Railroad.
My best friend is a member of the fraternity Kappa Alpha Psi, and they did a miniature walk from Cincinnati to Middletown, which is not the Underground Railroad per se, but they were doing it to honor the folks that had been on the Underground Railroad.
That's J.D. Vance territory.
Yeah.
That's another topic.
Maybe we should make him go on a walk.
I don't know.
Yeah, I talked to Herman Lester about 2-3 years ago. I guess we talked, and I said, we could do another walk. Yeah, we could. Because I was like, man, with all the sponsorship connections now, and we could really roll with all this, and. But then you start getting into it. I don't know. It just got to be too much, and so and everybody's schedules. No one could take a whole month off anymore. It was just crazy and stuff. So
not to mention we ain't up to it physically, Dave. Let's just be real.
I know. Well, one idea I had was we would just walk 1 or 2 miles, but we would have like an American diabetes tied to it, and groups could just do 8-mile or 10-mile components and so forth. So it'd still be win-win all the way around. But no, but the Underground Railroad is an interesting subject, and there have been other recreations. There's every now and then things will happen. It's a fantastic story. And it's just nice that, we never envisioned that we'd still be part of the Underground Railroad story. We're tied to this thing forever in our lives, and it's kind of interesting.
Right.
Who would have thought that? And so, it's a blessing, and we're honored to be part of this history and so forth, and we're honored to be part of
absolutely
history. So it's good.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. I think we're at our limit. I don't want to see us. So let's thank everybody and say it was great to see you.
See y'all at reunion.
Look forward to seeing you all at the reunion.
Yeah. 2 weeks.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.